Two and a Half Admins, episode 196. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, a quick plug for Linux Dev Time, episode 98, that you joined us on, Alan.
Yes.
We were talking about your company, Clara, and how you upstream all the code that you write, or most of the code that you write for your clients.
Yeah, and mostly about how developing it with the concept of we're going to upstream this first before the customer starts using it, and how that changes the normal dynamic of upstream as an afterthought, which tends to mean that a lot of stuff either doesn't go upstream or takes a lot longer than it should have to go upstream.
Yeah, well, link in the show notes. New Windows AI feature records everything you've done on your PC. This sounds so great. It'll take screenshots every few seconds, and then I'll be able to search through them using AI. What could possibly go wrong with this?
The even better part is that passwords and social security numbers and bank details and credit card numbers, none of that will be redacted.
But any DRM content will be.
You're not wrong there.
Yeah, they made specific callouts for DRM content and private browsing mode if you're using Microsoft Edge, but not other browsers.
Not Firefox.
Naturally.
Or even real Chrome.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that they have a cutout for DRM is especially galling considering how difficult it is to opt out otherwise.
So the other interesting part of this Copilot Plus story that I feel like hasn't gotten as much press time so far is that you can't actually support Copilot Plus on any Intel or AMD processor. It requires a neural processing unit that needs about quadruple the throughput of the top-end NPUs available in the Intel and AMD world right now. The only processors that will be available are Qualcomm Snapdragons that aren't quite out yet. That actually kind of makes me a little nervous, because it means that Microsoft is tying what looks like it's almost certainly going to be a very unpopular feature rollout, this very dystopian Big Brother-ish Copilot Plus, to something that I've been thinking would end up being very popular for quite some time now, which is a pivot to pure ARM, getting Microsoft, potentially almost all of the benefits that Apple has gotten out of its M1 and M2 designs. Now, is the Qualcomm Snapdragon going to be as fast as an M1 or M2? Probably not. It's an unreleased chip, but I doubt they will have caught up to Apple. But that's not the point. Top-end ARM chips, the kind of thing that you'd find in a flagship smartphone, have frankly been plenty fast enough for consumer general-purpose computing devices for quite some time. The only thing that's held them back is that nobody's really wanted to use them. Every time somebody in the general-purpose computing world has dipped their toes into the ARM world, they've just been like, oh, here's something that we can replace the absolute cheapest, crappiest, dog shit part of our lineup, CPUs, with, is the cheapest ARM processor we can find. If Microsoft starts delivering near M1 Air quality laptops, I think a lot of people are going to buy them.
Yeah, and we knew this was coming because they have... when Microsoft came out with the ARM dev kit boxes, when was that? Late 2022, I think. And I bought one and it's like, okay, so this has got a Qualcomm CPU in it that was, I think, 8 cores. So it was 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores or whatever. Not the same as Intel's, but it was the ARM equivalent, big.little. And that was 4 pretty beefy, like 3 gigahertz high-end cores and then 4 more efficient cores. And that was a pretty decent computer in the end. And that was just based on what they had for a relatively low-end Lenovo laptop, but got stuffed into a little NUC-like form factor for people to start building apps for Windows on ARM. And now to see them coming to this and adding all the AI stuff seems very interesting. And then, saddle it with this thing that I think will be super unpopular, make people want to avoid it. It seems like they might be almost dooming their transition to ARM before it starts.
I think dooming the transition to ARM is the more optimistic way to look at it personally, because I suspect that most people practical will go, I don't care what it's doing. I don't care if there's a piece of paper somewhere that says it'll get my firstborn kid when they turn 16. Here's the fast, fanless, low-power computer that I've always wanted. Sign me up.
Beyond the obvious concerns of it recording everything, and they talk about examples here of we can go back and watch the entire video of the teleconference you were in 2 months ago or whatever. It's aren't there laws in the US about recording other people without their permission? I know some states you only need one party's authorization to record, but some fraction of the states require informed consent on both sides, right? Otherwise, it's illegal wiretapping.
Yes. Although I'm not actually sure whether there are carve-outs for things like Zoom.
Well, because like in Zoom, if you record the meeting in Zoom, it gives a big warning to all the other people. This meeting is being recorded. Do you consent? And if not, you leave the meeting.
Yeah, I get that. But what I'm saying is I'm not sure that U.S. law actually applies to every possible form of interpersonal communication, or whether it's specifically tied to telephony and like personal recording devices for in-person meetings. Sometimes our laws are a little weird that way.
Yep.
I mean, you said beyond the obvious, but I think we need to state the obvious here. They have said that this is completely on device and will never leave it and is totally secure. But when has that ever worked? Like, it's never worked. It will get leaked at some point.
Well, not only that, but you remember a few years ago when, frankly, somebody who tends to get a lot more respect as a benevolent dictator than whoever is running Microsoft this week. Remember when Shuttleworth reminded everybody, I've got root on your PC? Microsoft has root on your Windows PC. I don't know how much it really freaking matters if all the processing is on device. Is that better than it happening in the cloud? Sure. Does that mean, no, you're good to go? Not if that thing's connected to the internet, it doesn't.
Right. And they claim it's all encrypted specific to the individual users on the device. But it's like, well, if I'm logged in as that user, it's got the encryption key loaded, doesn't it? And so any malware running on my computer can play all of it.
Yep.
And then it maybe even connecting with another story we're going to talk about soon. What about the case of I take my PC into a repair shop? Wouldn't happen to me specifically, but something like that. And it's like, obviously they maybe have the login to fix your computer, and then they can use replay and be like, well, what's this person been up to for the last 3 months? And then there's the practical considerations. They claim that the default allocation is 25 gigabytes of space, which can store approximately 3 months of these snapshots. Although I don't know if that's assuming the person doesn't work on their computer 8 hours a day, but uses it more occasionally. But A, that's a lot of space, but also B, that's not as much space as I would expect. I also wonder, they mentioned that, it's taking screenshots every couple of seconds. It's like, well, that would actually take up a lot of space. Even JPEGs is like, why wouldn't they do something closer to like the remote desktop protocol where it's knowing, hey, that's text in a window. I can have the text instead of a picture of the text. It would boost the AI processing and save a lot of space. But I don't know if they say screenshots because they're trying to explain it to people that don't understand those details, or if it is literal screenshots.
I suspect it's the former. They're just trying to use words that everybody will understand.
Mm-hmm.
For all we know, it could actually be more akin to a traditional MPEG stream where you've basically got keyframes and you just patch the keyframes in between. I mean, if you're taking the screenshots every few seconds, most of the time there's going to be a lot of commonality between one screenshot and the next.
Yep.
It's probably also worth pointing out that the minimum hardware spec, in addition to the Qualcomm CPU with the unobtainium neural processing unit, bare minimum is 256 gigs storage and 16 gigs of RAM. And if you have been paying attention to Microsoft for as long as I have, you will be well aware that Microsoft usually errs way on the low side when they give you minimum hardware requirements for their software and operating systems.
Yeah, 256 does not seem anywhere near enough for this.
If you have 256 gigs of storage in your device, I'm expecting Windows is going to use pretty much 200 gigs of that before you install any applications. And they specifically mentioned that while on a device with 256 gigs of space, the default will be 25 gigs for recall, it requires 50 gigs of available space so that you don't run completely out of space. And it does seem like you're probably not going to have any maneuvering room if you have the smallest disk in this thing.
I'm just going to go ahead and say it. My main interest in this story at this point is finding out how possible it will be to skunk the whole damn thing and install a proper Linux distribution on that hardware. Because I would love to have an ARM laptop. And as much as I potentially like the M1s and M2s, they're a little appley for my taste. If Microsoft's hardware comes out a little bit more generic and a little bit less obviously tied to an ecosystem I don't belong to, the hardware would be tempting.
I don't know how different it is from their original dev kit. I expect not too much since they wanted people to build the applications that way. But we got the Microsoft ARM dev kit booting FreeBSD a couple weeks after it came out.
Yeah, but that wasn't a released product sent to consumers. And
right.
I honestly just don't have a whole lot of faith that there won't be deliberate efforts, to lock you in.
Yeah, there was already enough fighting on the dev kit, and it was meant for doing more devy stuff. The other interesting thing, circling back to what Jim mentioned earlier, is the fact that the best thing that Intel has as far as an NPU on their newer processors does 10 trillion ops per second, And I think the AMD ones are in the like 16 trillion ops range.
14 to 16, yeah.
Yeah, and the Snapdragon does 45, and so Microsoft set their minimum at 40. And it's interesting to see. I don't know if that means maybe there will be add-in cards. They kind of, in the second article that we'll have to add to the show notes, they talked a bit about you can do most of your graphics processing on your CPU, but it's not the best at it. So we have GPUs. Might we actually see like NPUs as add-in cards that would allow machines to have that, or maybe a lot more neural processing units and operations per second without it necessarily having to be built into the CPU itself?
You're going to need a great bloody raft of PCI Express lanes if you want to have a hot GPU and a hot NPU both attached outside the die of the main processor, though.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Apple needs to explain that bug that resurfaced deleted photos. This is a piece on The Verge, and they'd been tracking this bug in iOS and iPadOS where people's deleted photos were just showing back up randomly.
So apparently this was corruption in the database that the iPhone apps use to track the photos. And so if it got corrupted, then it wouldn't have that file flagged as deleted and it would just show back up, which really raises the question of when you delete a file, it's not deleting it, it's just marking it deleted. You know, that is how disks work, but they seem to be doing it a bit different than that. And part of that is on purpose. They have this feature of recently deleted, which is supposed to allow you to undelete files within 30 days or whatever. But in the examples they had in the story, it sounded like there's like pictures that were deleted years ago just randomly showing up again.
Is this just as simple as deleting the bit on the disk that points to the data, but not the data itself?
So if you think back to how FAT32 worked, which is how I learned computers, if you deleted a file, the way it did that was just erasing the first letter of the file name from its index of files. So that meant if you ran the undelete command, it would find all the slots in the file allocation table where the first character was blank instead of a letter and be like, here's everything else of the file name except for the first character and where it is on disk. And if you hadn't overwritten the data with some other data, then it would be able to undelete the file. And it sounds like in the case of Apple here, just from the reporting, but there's no details, so we can't be sure. It sounds like, you know, they have a database that says, you know, about metadata about the images, and it was just marking the images, hide this one because it's deleted. And that was how their recently deleted feature worked. But it seems maybe it wasn't ever deleting things all the way. But then you wonder, like, how does the device not run out of space if it's not deleting the photos? And so there's quite a bit of unexplained here still.
Yeah, is it not using something equivalent to trim?
In this case, it sounds like the application is not actually deleting the file in the file system. It's just flagging it in its database. So it's not like the file system that's undeleting this file. It's just the application is never actually deleting the file. It's just marking this file as hide it.
There have been reports that the same bug has occurred with deleted voicemails as well, which points to the issue being quite possibly one more with the recently deleted functionality in general than photos specifically. But again, without more detail, it's very difficult to tell. And what little Apple said about it, they described this as a rare result of photos that experience database corruption. One might interpret that there is a database, probably along the lines of like, you know, a SQLite sort of setup that keeps track of how long photos have been in the recent photos, and the action to actually finally delete them might be triggered by their age as recorded in said database. And if that gets corrupted, well, then, you know, maybe the files never get properly deleted. Maybe they just stop showing up as visible in the recently deleted. And then on a subsequent scan of the entire device by an app that just looks for the type of files that it wants, then you might re-import the photos or the voicemails or what have you. But this is all just wild speculation because, again, Apple hasn't given us very concrete details.
Yeah, and like Jim said, it could basically be either way around. Either the database that marks that file as deleted is corrupt and so the file shows up again, or the database is supposed to say, all right, this is all the deleted stuff and we're going to remember to actually delete it after it's old enough, and that gets corrupted and so it never gets removed and then it gets found later. But either way, it has a problem. And it causes a lot of interesting issues here where when I delete a file, I may be expressing very clear intent that I want this file destroyed. At the same time, it is a very user-friendly feature to have the ability to undelete, especially on a phone with a touchscreen where you can easily accidentally tap the wrong icon on the screen and want to be able to undelete something. But at the same time, if you have a photo that you really wanted deleted or where the person you took the photo of asked you to delete it, and you're like, yes, I see, I deleted it, and then you can undelete it, that can be a whole different issue as well.
Yeah, delete versus shift delete, essentially.
Yeah. And I don't know if the recently deleted has something like empty trash to actually force things to get deleted, but it raises a whole bunch of questions there. And then we come back to what we were talking about in the previous story. If something goes wrong with my phone and I take it to the repair place, can they undelete or see photos I deleted? Because I know lots of people that would be very upset with somebody being able to go through their deleted photos.
I think it's probably worth mentioning also, we touched on it a little bit, but the severity and the scope and the ability of this problem to go unnoticed gets magnified greatly by the very tall and narrow app silos that you see in the mobile world. Mm-hmm. On a PC, if you had an issue with your deleted items folder that was causing things not to be deleted, there's a million different ways you might see those files because you can natively get at the file system, not just a little piece of it from each individual app, but you can actually go browsing through the whole file system. It's very trivial to just say, oh, I want to open up a file explorer and see what all is in the trash can. On a mobile device, not so much. You don't typically browse the file system directly at all, ever. You're really just using each app, and each app has its own storage that live on the file system, but you don't really cross the streams. And that makes it harder to notice something like this, because if your photo didn't show up in iPhotos, well, you assume it's deleted. You can't see it anywhere, right? But it might be right there, sitting plain as day on the file system, if only you ever actually looked at the file system. But you don't. It's phone.
Yeah, and then you also have the thing, how many people have maybe had Phantom running out of space because delete wasn't actually working like they thought it was? And they're like, I deleted all these photos and I didn't get all the space back because something didn't actually work correctly.
Yeah, and then you go to the disk usage and there's just like this big gray thing. So, well, okay, well, what is that?
How often do people even look at that? Like, I'm not telling you, I'm asking the question because, like, I never even look at the storage stuff on my phones or tablets.
That's because you buy the biggest possible storage because you don't want the SSD to wear out or the NAND or whatever.
You're absolutely correct. I still wonder how many normal people ever actually look at that instead of just being like, how come my phone won't take another photo? And like, that's as far as they get with it.
Well, I think generally I don't look at it until my device is complaining that I'm out of space or something.
Yeah, but if you don't understand the concept of a file system, are you even really going to understand the concept of the fact that that file system can fill up?
I think most people recognize, your device says how many gigabytes it can hold when you bought it, but
do they?
Maybe we're giving people too much credit now.
I can count the number of times I see a normal person go to the settings app on their phone on the fingers of one foot. Just never, man. They can't even find the apps, like the regular apps. If there's not a shortcut to it on their home screen for the mobile device, it's just not there as far as most people are concerned, in my experience.
Is that why on iOS there is no app drawer? It's just all on the desktop, effectively.
Very likely, yeah, because that's the only way that, you can know that people will actually see what's there in any way, shape, or form. That also brings its own problems because Apple still lets them organize it. And I need some heavy scare quotes there, however they see fit. So like if you're trying to help somebody with their iPhone issue, it can be an absolute nightmare trying to find where any given app they're having a problem with is, because God knows on which screen and in what folder they've nested it, how deep. It makes sense to their head, but maybe not to anybody else's. And you don't have really great tools to navigate it.
I don't like the wiggling, man. I don't like when you put it in that mode and they all just start wiggling at you.
Yeah.
I remember when Android added the just swipe up on any screen and it brings up the list of apps in alphabetical order. You still have all the home screens that you can scroll through and make your own folders and do shit for muscle memory. But if you're just looking for the things, swipe up and they're there in alphabetical order and with a little search thing, which actually reminds me more of how Mac OS works than Android. But it's interesting that Android implemented the same thing on the phone better than iPhone.
Whereas I would like all of these stupid gestures to go away. Like, I get that they're convenient if you know it already, but they're so undiscoverable.
Yeah.
And like we've already been talking about, like, how many people really understand all the things that their phone does? And like, if you don't know what swiping does as a normal person, what are the odds you're ever going to figure that out? There's nothing leading you through that. Like, you didn't take a course on like what mobile UI looks like this year in school. So,
I don't think you're giving young people enough credit, man. It's like how we just figured out what a mouse did and like instinctively know what left and right click is, single click, double click, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's great for them right now while they're 18 or 20 or pick your age, but they're going to be 30 eventually, and they're no longer going to have their entire being focused on that device and finding like as much as they can figure out of what it does. And I also think that you're giving all young people way the hell too much credit, because trust me, there's plenty of young people that are not really diving very deep into interfaces.
Yeah, and like even just thinking about the Gmail interface on my phone, it's like I keep forgetting if it's left or right to archive versus just mark as read. And there's no hint that does anything at all.
If we're going to draw one more analogy here, I think it probably helps to think of this iOS bug as an example of the same kind of issue you see with Snapchat, for example. I have had a lot of anguished parents and grandparents reach out to me over the last few years asking for help because their kid got naked on Snapchat, trusting that feature that says, oh, your video will be deleted on everybody's device as soon as it's done. And, it turns out people were recording their freaking screen one way or another. And next thing you know, your granddaughter's naked all over her high school. So I think ultimately it just comes down to like, no, when computers are involved, you cannot trust that everything will be deleted off of any device that you don't personally own, can't personally inspect, and unfortunately aren't personally technically competent of to be sure you understand all of the workings.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. Are you prepared for whatever shitstorm may hit your desk during the workday? Automox has your back. Check out the brand new Autonomous IT podcast. Listen in as various IT experts discuss the latest Patch Tuesday releases, mitigation tips, and custom automations to help with CVE remediations. Make new work friends. Listen now to the Autonomous IT podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you tune into your podcasts. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Christopher has done. He writes, how do you provide temporary restricted ad hoc access to folders on your NAS to non-technical folks? On my Synology, I can click share and get a link I can email them. Does anything like that exist in Ubuntu, FreeBSD, TrueNAS land? I know the first answer is don't do that, but real talk, I need to do that. Don't do that. I mean, just don't do it.
Well, no, what's interesting here is the meaning of a NAS has kind of shifted a little bit. Like a NAS is network attached storage. The idea is this is a file server on your LAN and it's only on your LAN. And so, no, it shouldn't be connected to the internet. But the NAS has also become slightly my personal self-hosted cloud where I can share files with people. And in that case, there's usually some software, something like Nextcloud, which would give you the ability to have different users with web access to only certain folders and be able to get a share link and stuff like that. But when you do that, you have to remember that now all the access control for those files is not permissions on your file system, not your chmod and so on. It's just in that software, Nextcloud in the example. And so if there's a bug in Nextcloud, then maybe they can access things they're not supposed to. And it's a whole different way of controlling stuff. And also you have to remember that the device that was set up as a NAS, was it designed to be facing the internet? Because if you haven't locked it down and done it specifically for that use case, then just chucking your NAS on the internet and throwing up a Nextcloud is probably not the right way to do it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but even with Nextcloud, if the Nextcloud instance is on your LAN, you have to provide some kind of access to it also. Like, it's not just going to tunnel out. Like, there's no magical, like, Nextcloud cloud service that will connect to A to B if you don't have any port forwarding going into your LAN from the internet, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Like, I think normally, I guess I kind of skipped over the part. If you were going to use Nextcloud to do this, you would have to forward the ports and set up the web server and actually make Nextcloud accessible from the internet so that the link you gave someone would actually not just be a 192.168 type IP address that they wouldn't be able to route.
Because that was going to be my next point, is that I'm not telling you don't do that. I mean, Joe just came out and said, don't do that. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say, understand what you're asking for. Because what you're asking for is not a NAS that sits in your house and you need to come into your house to access unless you make special provisions otherwise. Now what you're talking about is cloud storage. A Synology that has something as simple as like it sits in your house, but you can just click a link and email somebody a thing and they can get into it. Well, that's not really in your house anymore. That is now a part of the cloud on the internet. And the way that works is your Synology has to be connected to Synology Corporate's presence in the cloud. And that link that you email to somebody actually goes to the Synology cloud, which then goes over that already established tunnel out of your house and lets people into your house. So you're really talking about building like a gigantic pathway into your home network. And if that's a thing you truly want, cool. But be aware that is literally what we're talking about. We're not just talking about like, oh, I gave somebody temporary access to this one thing. You're talking about, oh, I paved a road going into my living room so that I could give somebody this link really easily that just did the thing. And if you don't like that, A, I don't blame you, and B, then your answer necessarily becomes a lot more complicated, and you do need to set up a VPN. And it might look more like, well, I set up a temporary username and password for them to access my NAS, and I gave them like a Tailscale key or whatever to allow them to get to my network, and now they can use that to get onto my NAS the same way that I do, but only have access to the folders that I want them to have. And you said temporary, so that means that, well, after I'm done with them having that access, I can just kill that Tailscale entry that they have to get them on my Tailscale network, or my WireGuard if you've set up your own thing from scratch or whatever, and you can kill the credentials that you set up for them. Is that a lot less convenient than just click and share and a link just magically goes out and works? Absolutely. Do you not have a giant 24/7, 365 paved highway leading into your living room? Also, yes, absolutely. So pick your poison. I'm not going to yell at you for either, but you should understand what it is that you have.
Yeah. And I think the first thing is that the other name for that highway from the internet into your machine is backdoor. This is not the normal way you get into my machine, but now there's this other semi-opaque way to get in. And in particular, that depends on you trusting Synology to only let the people you said in and not have a goof up like we saw with those security cameras where people could watch other people's cameras because there was a goof up in their software on the web. So if Synology has one of these goof ups or gets hacked or whatever, then suddenly everybody can access your NAS over the internet and all the access restrictions you sent to Synology are just ignored.
That also means that Synology itself has access to all your stuff at all times, 24/7, 365, because if it did not, you would not be able to grant that access. Now, I'm not trying to say something evil or horrible about Synology, and I'm sure their public relations department would be super quick to jump out and say, well, we have this protection and that protection and the other protection to keep just any rogue Synology employee from doing exactly the thing that I just described. And those are good things. You absolutely can limit access control that employees have, to this kind of presence. That's a good thing. It can and it should be done, but it doesn't change the fact that ultimately the system itself has access all the time, which means that some subset of the humans who work for Synology have the capability to use that for purposes other than what you envisioned. And if you don't like that, the only way to avoid it is to not pave that highway into your living room in the first place.
So the reason that I said don't do this is because of free cloud storage, like Google Drive, for example. So whether you upload it to Google Drive yourself or you let them download it from you and therefore upload it to them, you're uploading it anyway. So why not just stick it somewhere like Drive, give them a link, and then they're nowhere near your LAN?
Because they might not want every single file that you have, even out of the subset that you're willing to let them have. They might only want one out of like 500 gigs of data. And if you're doing it the way you're describing, you have to upload all 500 gigs to the cloud, let them pick and choose through it, and then delete the rest. Whereas if you just let them in, they can browse, get the thing they want, and only that thing has to go out through your upload pipe. Even more importantly, I suspect to most people, is just a difference of how much work they have to do personally. When you say you can either let somebody download the thing or you can upload it first so they can download it later, what most people will hear is you're asking me to do more work that I don't feel like doing. That sounds like a pain in the butt.
And the other thing can be latency. Like Jim was saying, if you have to upload 500 gigs, that's going to take a really long time. They can't start downloading most of that until you've finished uploading it, or at least whole files. Whereas if they access stuff directly, they could probably do it. And then depending on where the people are relative to each other, it might be almost as fast or faster to do it directly instead of bouncing it through the cloud. But to Jim's point, without something like the service Synology has to kind of be that reflector, your only option is to put your whole NAS out on the internet. And that requires a level of sophistication that you have to know how to port forward or even just have enough control over the network that your NAS is on to do that. And not everybody has that.
I think it's just a mindset difference, man. I think that for me, it's like you said earlier on in this conversation. For me, a NAS is something that sits on my LAN. And yeah, I can get into my LAN from outside with a VPN, but that's me getting into it. This is my LAN. This is not the internet. Like, I have stuff that is out on the internet and I have stuff that's on my LAN. And those two are just, I don't cross the streams.
Yes, but let me bring up one point here, lest we be accused of some kind of elitism, hilariously, mostly coming from Joe. We're not above using this kind of thing ourselves. Alan has a Plex server. Joe and I have access to Alan's movies. They live in Alan's house. It's not like we're above using this kind of tool when it feels appropriate to us. And so I don't want to give people the impression that we're being all snooty and saying you can't and you shouldn't and just don't. Because maybe you can and you should and you actually want to, and it's not the stupidest thing ever. I just want everybody to understand what they're doing.
You would not catch me installing Plex on anything in my LAN, I tell you, and sharing it with anyone. Sorry.
So in mine, the Plex is a separate container. It has access to a specific set of files that are ones I'm fine with sharing. And so I'm happy to do it.
And that's because Alan knew exactly what he was doing, considered all the details, and set it up in the way that made him feel comfortable. And again, all I'm saying is I want our listeners to have all the tools and the information to be able to make those same decisions wisely for themselves.
I think that is a big part of my mindset here, is that I know enough to know that I don't know enough to do this, if that makes sense. I know that if I just keep it completely separate, I'll be fine. If I just keep my LAN to be my LAN and the internet to be the internet and just don't cross those streams, I'll be fine. But the second I start opening ports and letting someone in to do this, that, and the other, I know that I don't know enough about it to do it safely.
And I genuinely think that's admirable. I just don't think that you get to dictate what decisions along those lines make sense for everybody in the whole world any more than I do or Alan does.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And I would just say that as the security landscape has changed, we've mostly had to get away from the idea of inside versus outside, because it turns out most of the attacks turn out to come from inside now. And so just because something's on your LAN doesn't mean that it should be trusted and have unfettered access to your NAS.
The call is coming from inside the building.
What a lot of people sometimes fail to consider with their NAS is that if every computer in your house has access to the NAS, because that's the point of the NAS, is where you share files between all your computers, and maybe you're the sophisticated one and your computer isn't the one that's going to get hit with ransomware. But if some computer that has write access to your NAS gets hit with ransomware, that ransomware is going to try and encrypt everything on your NAS. So just because it's coming from inside the LAN doesn't necessarily mean you should trust it.
Which is why you have ZFS, snapshots, and an offsite backup machine that is pulling from the NAS, not being pushed to.
Yep.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and Twitter.
See you next week.